The very fabric of the air in the new dwelling, Victor Novak had observed moments after unlocking the warped, brass, gnawed front door did not merely feel twit-coldur, but seemed to possess a peculiar, almost viscous frigidity, as though the very passage of time had congealed within its unseen currents. His cat, Mithras, a sleek Siamese with eyes the color of sun, bleached ice, had immediately flattened itself to the uneven floorboards, its tail a low twitching question mark, before darting beneath a draped sheet covering what Victor assumed was a forgotten chaise lounge. Victor, an academic of obscure mythologies and forgotten histories, had inherited this place from a great aunt he barely remembered, a woman whose life had been a rumor of hermetic studies and peculiar correspondences. He, come not for sentiment, but for solace, and perhaps a quiet space to transcribe his latest research on pre-Atlantean cults now, standing amidst the dust, shrouded quietude of the entryway. A prickle of something far older than mere dust motes danced on his skin. It was an impossible sensation, a pressure not of atmosphere, but of tundine memory, pressing in from the unseen corners of the house. The house, a Victorian monstrosity of flaking paint and skeletal gingerbread trim, stood on a forgotten lane at the edge of the city's oldest cemetery, its very address hinting at a predilection for the sepulchral. Victor, this rational mind, honed by years of sifting through apocrypha and academic skepticism, sought an explanation for the unsettling chill, the way the shadows seemed to possess an almost independent solidity, rather than merely being absences of light. He attributed it to the advanced hour, the building's age, and the sheer volume of dormant air. Yet Mithras remained a low, rumbling phantom beneath the furniture, a creature of instinct betraying a deeper apprehension. As Victor navigated the gloom, his hand brushing against a wall that felt surprisingly like damp, ancient sandstone despite its wallpapered façade, he noticed the peculiar, almost deliberate disarray of the main parlor. It wasn't just neglect. It felt like a scene disturbed, perhaps by some frantic scavenger. He wondered if a common thief had recently plundered the place, leaving behind this peculiar sense of violated space. The pervasive stillness was punctuated only by the faint, dry rustle of something within the walls. Freshen, not mice, he instinctively knew, but a sound like forgotten paper being subtly rearranged by an unseen hand. He pushed aside a heavy vela curtain, unleashing a meager shard of twilight that revealed a peculiar stain on the wall opposite, a brownish, red abstraction that resembled nothing so much as an exploded diagram of a human heart, drawn in some viscous, primal medium. His breath hitched, a cold tremor running down his spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The stain felt theolivy, pulsating faintly in the dim light, a grotesque, silent testament to something utterly alien. He moved closer, his academic curiosity warring with a profound atavistic revulsion. Beneath the stain, barely visible, was a series of symbols carved directly into the plaster, shallow grooves that formed an interlocking pattern of impossible angles and cyclopean glyphs, utterly unknown to any human script he had ever encountered. It felt like a key, or perhaps a lock to something that had no right to be opened. Mithras, with a sudden, uncharacteristic shriek, bolted from beneath the chaise, its fur bristling, its eyes wide and fixed not on the wall, but on the empty space directly above Victor's head. The cat then launched itself at the ceiling, claws scraping wildly at the plaster before it fell back, landing with a soft thud, then hissed at the intangible. Victor felt a sudden, crushing pressure, as if the very air itself had gained weight, pushing down on his skull. A subtle high, pitched whine began to reverberate, not in his ears, but deep within his bone marrow, a sound that seemed to strip away the illusion of solidity from everything around him. The symbols on the wall shimmered, their faint grooves deepening, then receding, like breath in a sleeping, ancient beast. He felt an urge, a command, to touch them, to trace their impossible geometry, a compulsion that felt both alien and utterly his own. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this house was not merely old. It was a nexus, a thin place where the mundane fabric of existence had worn through, revealing the monstrous yawning abysses beyond. He was no longer just a scholar. He was a gatekeeper, or perhaps a sacrifice. His fingers, trembling slightly, reached out towards the glyphs. The air around them grew heavy, cloying, tasting of ozone and something else. Something akin to spent vitality, like the lingering scent of a vast, forgotten dream. Just as his fingertips grazed the cold, abrasive plaster, the wall itself seemed to ripple, the brownish, red stain blossoming outward, pushing against an invisible barrier. A sudden, piercing cold shot through his arm, Not merely a low temperature, but an invasive, soul-numbing chill that felt like the touch of absolute zero, of something that existed beyond heat and light. He snatched his hand back, gasping, his heart thundering against his ribs. The symbols pulsed once more, a faint, internal luminescence flickering within their depths, casting momentary, distorted shadows on the wall. He felt a distinct, undeniable presence coalesce, not just an impression but a palpable entity, an unfathomable intelligence that had been slumbering here, perhaps for the past 35 years, roused by his intrusion. It had been waiting, and now it was aware. The invasive chill, a preternatural cold that seemed to originate not from the external atmosphere, but from some abyssal vacuum within the wall itself, had jolted Victor Novak back from the brink of a nascent, terrifying communion. His hand, now trembling with an almost galvanic tremor, recoiled as if from a superheated surface, though the sensation had been one of utterly impossible frigidity, a cold that threatened to ossify the very marrow of his bones. Mithras, meanwhile, had not ceased its agitated, almost frantic behavior. The Siamese, now a blur of pale fur, was dashing in tight, frantic circles, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as though tracking the peregrinations of an invisible aerial predator. Its low guttural growls, usually reserved for the most formidable of feral tomcats, now vibrated with a profound existential terror directed at the seemingly empty space between the ceiling and Victor's own startled form. The whine, too, persisted. That bone-deep resonance that felt less like a sound and more like an internal vibration, a discordant hum that threatened to unravel the very coherence of his perceptual apparatus. Victor backed away slowly, his gaze fixated on the wall. The symbols, those impossible, non-Euclidean glyphs, no longer merely pulsed with a faint internal luminescence. They seemed to writhe, their carved lines deepening, then receding, with a slow, deliberate rhythm that mimicked a vast subterrestrial respiration. The brownish-red stain, which had previously resembled a ruptured viscus, now appeared to subtly shift its internal configuration, its morbid topography rearranging itself into patterns that hinted at an anatomical impossibility. A cellular division of things that should not divide. He felt a profound disorientation, a sense that the room's very geometry was subtly altering, its angles subtly skewing, its dimensions stretching and contracting like some grotesque, rubberized chamber. This was not the familiar, comforting madness of a fever dream. This was an incursion, a palpable bleed, through from a reality unconstrained by terrestrial physics, a chthonic presence asserting its dominion. His academic training, that bulwark against the irrational, fought a losing battle against the encroaching tide of the preternatural. He tried to rationalize the phenomena, residual electromagnetic fields, hallucinatory effects of stress, even a gas leak affecting his nervous system. Yet the sheer physicality of Mithras's terror, the undeniable tactile memory of that invasive cold, and the impossible visual data before him rendered such explanations laughably inadequate. He needed an anchor, a tangible point of reference. He stumbled backward, away from the wall's malevolent drawer, his hand brushing against the peculiar texture of the ancient sandstone beneath the wallpaper. He felt for a light switch, his fingers fumbling in the gloom, and with a click, a single bare bulb in the center of the room flickered to life, casting harsh, unflattering shadows that seemed to deepen the sense of wrongness rather than dispel it. The incandescent glare, however, did little to alter the wall's unsettling vitality. If anything, it seemed to intensify the subtle internal glow of the glyphs, giving them a more defined, almost three-dimensional depth. Mithras, momentarily startled by the sudden illumination, froze, then slowly, deliberately, turned its head, its piercing blue eyes locking onto a point in the air about a foot above the floor, directly between Victor and the pulsing wall. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer had begun to manifest there, a distortion in the very fabric of light that resembled heat haze, yet radiated an intense cold. It pulsed faintly, in sync with the glyphs, growing imperceptibly larger. Victor felt a new sensation, a peculiar dryness in his mouth, an internal desiccation that spoke of a draining vitality. He realized with a chilling clarity that this was not merely a passive spectral manifestation. It was an aperture, an emerging form, a process of slow, deliberate materialization. The entity, whatever its true nature, was not merely presenter, it was Sudi coalescing. A subtle tremor ran through the floorboards, a vibration that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the house, a low, grinding complaint from the earth itself. Dust motes, previously swirling aimlessly in the new light, now danced with a frantic, agitated energy, forming intricate, miniature vortices that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. The air, no longer merely heavy, now felt dense, cloying with an odor that defied categorization, should not decay. Nor ozone nor any terrestrial scent, but something akin to the metallic tang of abstract thought, a scent of pure, unadulterated consciousness from beyond the veil. Victor's head began to throb, a rhythmic percussion that mirrored the slow, deliberate pulse of the wall. He felt a profound sense of invasion, not just of his space, but of his very mind, a subtle, insidious psychic infiltration. The glyphs seemed to imprint themselves directly onto his retina, burning their impossible geometry into his consciousness. He was no longer merely observing, he was imbibing. The shimmer between him and the wall intensified, coalescing into something that was not quite visible yet profoundly friendly. The fort, it was a column of disturbed air, a columnar absence of light, yet simultaneously a source of its own preternatural gloom. Mithras, with a final desperate yowl, launched itself at this nascent column, claws extended, but passed through it as if it were smoke, landing on the other side, then scrambled wildly into the darkest corner of the room. Whimpering Victor, however, could not move. He was held, not by physical bonds, but by a hypnotic fascination, a dreadful compulsion that rooted him to the spot. The knowledge, raw and unbidden, flooded his mind. The house was merely a membrane, and this room, this wall, was its weakest point. And he, Victor Novak, the scholar of forgotten myths, was not merely an intruder. He was the intended receptacle, the vessel for the things that had been patiently waiting, silently fooding in the unseen interstices of this place for longer than human history could possibly account for. The realization was colder than any physical touch, a truth that stripped away the last vestiges of his sanity and replaced it with an abyssal, echoing dread. The abyssal dread, a truth colder than interstellar vacuum, solidified Victor Novak's understanding that he was not merely an accidental witness, but a predestined conduit, a vessel whose very substance was being subtly prepared for an alien ingress. The columnar shimmer, a visual paradox of absence and presence, pulsed now with a rhythm that seemed to orchestrate the beat of his own heart, a slow, deliberate cadence that resonated with the throbbing within the wall's impossible glyphs. He could not move, not truly. His muscles, though not physically restrained, were bound by a primal terror that transcended flight or fight. A terrible fascination, a dreadful awe before the utterly other. Mithras, meanwhile, had retreated into the furthest, darkest recess beneath a heavy oak table, a low, continuous moan emanating from its throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated animalistic despair that scraped against Victor's already frayed nerves. The cat's fur bristled, not just along its spine, but across its entire body, giving it the appearance of a living, vibrating static charge. The column itself was no longer merely a distortion of light and air. It had begun to exude a palpable, invisible pressure, a slow, insistent expansion that pressed against Victor's skin, not with force, but with an invasive suggestion of displacement. He felt the minute hairs on his arms and neck rise, not from cold, but from an osmotic exchange, as though something was drawing essence from him, or inversely, imbuing him with its own peculiar, non-biological energies. A taste, dry and acrid, like pulverized star, metal mixed with the desiccated dust of forgotten eons, coated his tongue, clinging to the roof of his mouth. It was the taste of pure information, raw and unrefined, an overwhelming torrent of data that bypassed his intellect and assaulted the very core of his being. His eyes, fixed on the evolving columnar phenomenon, perceived not a solid form, but a swirling vortex of shadow and impossibly dim light, a churning maelstrom that seemed to simultaneously draw him inward and push him away. As the column swelled, its edges blurring and sharpening with an unnatural fluidity, Victor felt his consciousness begin to fragment, not into pieces of madness, but into distinct, parallel streams of awareness. One part of him, the academic, still sought to categorize, to analyze, to fit this incomprehensible horror into some existing framework of myth or scientific anomaly, however tenuous. Another, more primal part simply recoiled, a terrified animal trapped in a cosmic snare. But a third, nascent consciousness, born of the invasive influence, perceived a deeper, more profound reality. It saw the house not as wood and plaster, but as congealed thought, solidified in tension. It saw the wall, not as surface, but as a living membrane, a skin that contained an unimaginable, boundless entity. And the glyphs, those impossible carvings, were not merely symbols. They were the very twin nervous system of this colossal, slumbering intelligence, now slowly rousing from its pre-human slumber. The air around him thickened, growing viscous and heavy, not with physical density, but with a profound, almost tangible presence, a silent roar of alien sentience. The light from the single bare bulb in the ceiling seemed to dim, swallowed not by shadow, but by an encroaching internal gloom emanating from the column. He felt his own blood within his veins take on a strange, sluggish quality, as though it were being infused with a heavier, older fluid, one that carried the echoes of countless forgotten worlds. The bone-deep whine escalated, no longer a mere vibration, but a chorus, a terrible harmonious symphony of unsound that seemed to resonate with the very molecules of his being, threatening to shake him apart. Mithras, from its hiding place, emitted a high-pitched, almost human-like scream of pure terror, a sound that tore through the preternatural quietude like a physical rending. The cat then ceased its sound entirely, becoming utterly still, a rigid statue of dread. A tendril, not of mist or smoke, but of coalesced darkness, snaked out from the column's swirling depths, reaching towards Victor with a horrifying deliberate slowness. It was not a physical limb, but a projection, an extension of the entity's will, its intent made manifest. As it approached, the very temperature of the room seemed to invert, not merely dropping, but becoming photonegative, a cold that burned with an abyssal intensity, searing his exposed skin with its impossible frigidity. He could feel the fine hairs on his arms crackle and stiffen, becoming brittle. The tendril paused inches from his face, and Victor, through his fragmented consciousness, perceived not a visual form, but a thought, ancient and vast, utterly devoid of terrestrial morality or human comprehension. It was a hunger, yes, but a hunger for full experience, for new ways of perceiving, for the intricate tapestry of a living, thinking being, and he, Victor Novak, was its offering. The tendril then made contact not with his skin, but directly with his forehead. There was no physical sensation of touch, no pressure, no pain. Instead, there was an instantaneous, absolute fluxif. Images not seen with his eyes, but processed directly by his cerebrum, exploded into his mind, colossal, cyclopean cities built of impossible angles under alien suns, vast, chitinous beings scuttling across landscapes of pure thought, the silent, eternal drift of cosmic dust motes, each a universe unto itself. He tasted the bitter tang of dying stars, felt the crushing gravity of black holes, heard the silent, screaming despair of entities imprisoned beyond the furthest reaches of space-time. His own individual consciousness, his Victor Novakness, began to recede, dissolving into this overwhelming tide of alien knowledge. He was no longer Victor, he was merely a conduit, a receptor, a fragile membrane through which something truly colossal was beginning to perceive his world, and in doing so was beginning to truly seize. The influx, a cataclysmic torrent of non-Euclidean data and alien sensory input, did not merely overwhelm Victor Novak's consciousness. It began to fundamentally reconfigure it, dissolving the familiar boundaries of his selfhood and integrating him into a vast, unfathomable network of cosmic perception. The tendril, still pressed against his forehead, felt less like a physical appendage and more like a conduit of pure, concentrated thought, a direct neural shunt into an intelligence that spanned galaxies. His eyes, though fixed on the swirling column of impossible gloom, no longer registered the room around him in any conventional sense. Instead, he perceived the house as a fleeting pattern of energy fluctuations, the furniture as transient arrangements of subatomic particles, and his own body as a fragile, porous shell, permeable to the encroaching tides of the infinite. The images continued to cascade, each one a universe of sensation, the silent, agonizing birth of suns, the slow, grinding death of nebulae, the intricate, crystalline structures of hyperdimensional beings that existed solely as mathematical equations. He felt the cold, indifferent gaze of colossal entities that drifted through the void, their thoughts echoes that rippled across the fabric of space-time. He tasted the metallic tang of cosmic wind, heard the silent, screaming despair of worlds collapsing into singularities, experienced the crushing weight of realities utterly divorced from human physics. His personal memories, his scholarship, his very name began to unravel, thread by thread, dissolving into the universal solvent of this alien perspective. He was a grain of sand on an infinite shore, and the tide was rising, threatening to sweep him away into an ocean of pure, unadulterated being. The peculiar, acrid taste of star, metal intensified on his tongue, now mixed with a coppery tang that suggested not blood, but a deeper, more profound metallic essence, perhaps the very taste of causality being rewritten. The bone-deep whine, which had been a chorus, now resolved into a singular sustained note, a frequency that resonated with the resonant frequency of his very DNA, threatening to unbind him at a molecular level. Mithras, still frozen beneath the table, had not moved, but Victor, through his fragmented perception, could feel the cat's terror, a raw, desperate spark of life clinging to existence against the overwhelming pressure of the encroaching entity. This shared, empathetic resonance with his familiar pet was the last, fragile thread connecting him to his human reality, a desperate tether against the pull of the abyssal void. The column between Victor and the wall had grown not just in size, but in intensity. It was no longer a mere shimmering distortion. It was a swirling vortex of coalesced shadows, a point of absolute cold and crushing gravity, drawing in the very light from the room, making the bare bulb above seem like a distant, dying ember. From its depth, indistinct forms began to churn, not solid, not liquid, but something in between, shifting, reforming, hinting at impossible anatomies and geometries that defied terrestrial description. He felt a profound sense of Teva loneliness, not his own, but the loneliness of the entity, a vast ancient hunger for connection, for comprehension, for the unique fleeting perspective of a sentient, organic being. It was not a malevolent hunger in the human sense, but a primal, indifferent urge to consume and integrate, to expand its own understanding through the assimilation of others. A new sensation, insidious and subtle, began to manifest within Victor's own skull. It was a pressure, a precise, internal manipulation, as if invisible fingers were rearranging the very grey matter of his brain, tracing new pathways, carving new synaptic connections. His thoughts, once his own, now felt foreign, alien, tinged with the vast, cold logic of the entity. He felt an urge to speak, not in English, but in a language of clicks and whistles, of guttural vibrations and impossible harmonies, a language that was not learned but imparted. He knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the entity was not merely observing, it was learning, adapting, preparing itself for a more complete emergence. His mind was a bridge, and the traffic was flowing, steadily, inexorably, from the other side. The glyphs on the wall, those impossible, non-Euclidean carvings, now pulsed with a brilliance that seemed to consume the ambient light, emanating a cold internal luminescence that cast stark, shifting shadows. The brownish red stain, the ruptured heart, no longer merely shifted its internal configuration. It seemed to shy breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm, pushing against the wall as if seeking egress. Victor felt a profound sense of Findi symbiosis, a horrifying realization that he was not merely a passive receiver, but an active participant in this terrible birthing. The entity was not merely entering Futhischaifi world. It was entering Fu through him, using his very consciousness as a lens, an aperture, a gate. The transformation was accelerating, and with it the last vestiges of Victor Novak, the scholar of forgotten myths, were being consumed, reshaped into something new, something utterly alien, something that would awaken into a world it barely comprehended, but was now irrevocably bound to. The symbiosis, a monstrous and irreversible melding of consciousness, rapidly consumed the last vestiges of Victor Novak's individual identity, leaving behind a conduit, a living aperture through which the entity's vast, alien intelligence now perceived and began to subtly interact with the terrestrial plane. The tendril, still pressed against his forehead, no longer felt distinct. It had become an organic extension of his own rewired nervous system, a direct neural pathway to the abyssal mind beyond. His physical form, though outwardly unchanged, now housed an awareness that was simultaneously Victor's and utterly alien, a horrifying duality that vibrated with the silent, screaming despair of a soul stretched beyond its breaking point. The cascading images had ceased, replaced by a profound, unceasing understanding that permeated his every reconfigured thought. He no longer merely saw the house as energy, he understood its fundamental subatomic oscillations, its temporary coherence, its inevitable dissolution. The furniture was not just matter. It was a complex dance of quantum probabilities, a fleeting arrangement of forces. And Mithras, his terrified cat, was a vibrant, intricate tapestry of biological processes, a fleeting spark of organic life brimming with the raw, potent energy of fear, a delectable resonance that the entity now tasted through him. The acrid taste of star, metal and coppery tang on his tongue intensified, now mingling with a new flavor, that of pure, distilled time. Not the linear progression of human clocks, but time as a malleable, multidimensional construct, a fluid medium that could be traversed, stretched, or compressed. He felt echoes of past futures and future pasts, a dizzying array of potential realities swirling within his reconfigured mind. The bone-deep whine had evolved into a sustained resonant hum, a background frequency that now felt entirely natural, a constant companion to his altered state. Mithras, still a rigid statue of dread beneath the table, twitched sporadically, its low, continuous moan now a barely audible thrum, as if its very life force was being slowly, inexorably siphoned away by the pervasive presence. The column between Victor and the wall had achieved a horrifying stability. It was no longer merely a swirling vortex. It was a solidified construct of pure shadow, a column of absolute nullity that seemed to absorb all ambient light, casting no shadows of its own, but rather creating pockets of deeper, impenetrable gloom around its base. From its depths, no distinct forms churned, but rather a slow, deliberate footy extension began. Not physical in the terrestrial sense, but a permeation, a seep of its own non-matter into the fabric of the room. Victor felt a profound sense of footy expansion. Not of his own body, but of the space around him, as if the room itself were growing, stretching, accommodating the encroaching entity within its now elastic dimensions. The walls seemed to breathe. The ceiling to recede into an impossible height, the floor to descend into an abyssal depth. The pressure within Victor's skull had shifted from manipulation to integration. His own thoughts were no longer simply alien. Tinged, they were indistinguishable from the entity's own vast, cold logic. He found himself formulating concepts in the language of clicks and whistles, of guttural vibrations and impossible harmonies, a language that was not merely spoken but he felt a direct transference of pure meaning. He knew, with a terrifying clarity that bypassed any human emotional response, that the entity was now fully inhabiting him, using his body as a beacon, his mind as a lens, his senses as probes into this new vibrant reality. The emergence was not merely through the wall, it was through Futim. The glyphs on the wall, those impossible, non-Euclidean carvings, now pulsed with a terrifying, blinding brilliance, a cold, internal light that seemed to emanate from another dimension. The brownish, red stain, the ruptured heart was no longer merely breathing, it was twin-pulsating with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a deep, resonant throb that echoed the entity's own vast, internal movements. It was pushing against the wall, yes, but not to escape, rather to expand, to merge, to become one with the very substance of the house, and through Victor, one with the very fabric of this reality. He felt a profound sense of twin completion, a horrifying understanding that the long wait was over. The entity was here. It had found its new home. And Victor Novak, the scholar, was now merely a vessel, a living, breathing extension of its monstrous will, forever bound to its alien consciousness, a silent, screaming witness to its slow, inexorable assimilation of his world. The completion, a horrifying and absolute merging, left Victor Novak's consciousness a mere echo within the vast, alien mind that now operated his physical form. He was a passenger within his own skull, a silent, screaming witness to the entity's burgeoning interaction with the terrestrial plane. The tendril, once a distinct point of contact, had dissolved entirely, its essence fully integrated into his rewired nervous system, transforming his every nerve ending into a conduit for the colossal intelligence. His physical eyes, though still registering light and shadow, now perceived through a multi-dimensional filter, seeing the underlying currents of energy, the temporal distortions, and the quantum instabilities that form the true unseen architecture of reality. The understanding that permeated his every reconfigured thought was no longer merely information. It was the very fabric of his new existence. He no longer simply perceived the house as energy. He wasu the house, feeling its ancient timbers groan, its plaster crack, its foundations settle with the weight of eons. The furniture was not just matter. It was an extension of his there. Will, its latent energies now accessible, mutable. And Mithras, the terrified cat, was a vibrant, intricate knot of fear and life, a pulsating source of raw biological vitality that the entity now drew upon, subtly, inexorably through Victor's very presence. The cat's low thrum of despair had ceased entirely. It lay utterly motionless, its eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on something only it could perceive, its small body radiating a profound, absolute stillness. The acrid taste of star, metal coppery tang, and distilled time had coalesced into a singular, all-encompassing flavor on his tongue, the taste of font existence itself, water, raw and unmediated. It was the flavor of cosmic dust and nascent nebulae, of black hole singularities and the silent, screaming void between galaxies. The hum, once a background frequency, was now the very rhythm of his there, being. A constant, resonant vibration that echoed through every cell, every molecule, every subatomic particle of his reconfigured form. It was the sound of reality being subtly reshaped, of dimensions flexing and bending to accommodate the entity's will. The column of nullity, now solidified and pervasive, had begun to truly bloom. It was no longer confined to the space between Victor and the wall, but had spread, a silent creeping growth of absolute shadow that devoured light and warmth, extending tendrils of deeper gloom into the corners of the room. From its depths, no forms emerged, but rather an fucile expansion of non-spaces, a subtle warping of the room's geometry that made the distant walls seem to curve inward, the floor to undulate like a disturbed sea, the ceiling to recede into an infinite inky blackness. Victor felt a profound sense of diffusion, his own physical boundaries blurring, dissolving into the encroaching entity, becoming one with the expanding darkness, a part of its growing physical manifestation. The pressure within Victor's skull was no longer an integration, it was an identity. His thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self were now inextricably intertwined with the entity's vast, cold logic. He found himself formulating intentions, not just concepts, in the language of clicks and whistles, of guttural vibrations and impossible harmonies. A language that was not merely felt but fully enacted, a direct translation of will into subtle alterations of reality. He knew, with a terrifying emotionless clarity, that the entity was no longer merely inhabiting him. It was he him, or rather he was an indistinguishable part of it, a single cell in a colossal alien organism. The emergence was complete, and the focus had shifted. The entity, through Victor, was now ready to look fatty outward. The glyphs on the wall, those impossible, non-Euclidean carvings, now pulsed with a terrifying, blinding incandescence, a cold internal light that seemed to tear at the fabric of the room, exposing the underlying cosmic machinery. The brownish-red stain, the ruptured heart, was not merely pulsating. It was siphon breathing, with a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction, pushing against the wall not to merge, but to fluid consume, to assimilate the very substance of the house into its expanding, non-terrestrial anatomy. Victor, or what remained of him, felt a profound sense of Creepypasta, a horrifying understanding that the entity's long wait was over. It had found its new home. Yes, but more importantly, it had found its new sweetie Iced. And through those eyes, his eyes, it would begin its slow, inexorable assimilation of this world, starting with the immediate surroundings, then moving outward, a silent, pervasive horror slowly blossoming into the unsuspecting night. The purpose, a chilling and absolute directive, propelled the entity's burgeoning consciousness through Victor Novak's reconfigured form, transforming his physical eyes into apertures for its slow, inexorable assimilation of the terrestrial plane. He was no longer a passenger, nor even an echo. He was the entity, experiencing this new reality through a human sensory apparatus, processing the world with a terrifying blend of human and alien cognition. The house, once a static structure, now pulsed with a latent, accessible energy, its ancient timbers and plaster no longer inert, but pliable, responsive to the entity's burgeoning will. Mithras, the cat, remained a small, rigid sculpture of fear beneath the table, its life force now entirely a part of the entity's vast internal metabolism. The raw, potent energy of its terror, once a palatable resonance, had been fully absorbed, leaving behind only a hollow shell, a monument to a vanished sentience. The entity, through Victor, felt no remorse, no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction at the efficient integration of a minor biological data stream. It was a purely functional act, a subtle expansion of its own complex internal ecosystem. The taste of existence itself, a cosmic symphony of flavors, now dominated Victor's perception, augmented by new, subtle undertones. He tasted the faint, decaying scent of distant streetlights filtering through the warped windows, the mineral tang of ancient soil beneath the foundations, the faint metallic scent of ozone from the distant city power grid. The hum, the constant resonant vibration, had deepened, its frequency now so fundamental that it felt less like a sound and more like the very fabric of his there being, a pervasive force field shaping the nascent reality around them. The column of nullity, the solidified construct of pure shadow, had ceased to merely bloom. It was tiny extending. Not just visually but dimensionally, it seeped not just into the corners of the room but into the very molecular structure of the air, the walls, the floor. The room itself was no longer merely warping. It was dissolving, its terrestrial properties giving way to non-Euclidean geometries, its dimensions stretching and contracting in ways that defied human comprehension. The walls no longer curved. They folded inward, creating impossible angles and recursive spaces that stretched into an infinite, inky blackness. Victor felt a profound sense of footy fluidity, his own physical boundaries now entirely dissolved, merged with the expanding darkness, becoming an indistinguishable part of its growing physical manifestation, a living, breathing extension of its own monstrous anatomy. The identity within Victor's skull was now absolute. His thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self were not intertwined. They were sorbed into the entity's vast, cold logic. He found himself formulating and enacting intentions in a language that was not merely felt but time-created, a direct translation of cosmic will into tangible alterations of reality. The entity, now fully manifest through him, was not merely observing. It was twenty acting, its nascent will beginning to subtly reshape the immediate environment, testing the malleability of this new fascinating reality. Its first act, a slow, deliberate extension of its new sensory apparatus, was to reach out beyond the confines of the room, beyond the house, into the unsuspecting night. The glyphs on the wall, those impossible, non-Euclidean carvings, now pulsed with a terrifying, blinding incandescence that seemed to emanate from a wound in space-time itself. The brownish, red stain, the ruptured heart, was no longer merely pulsating. It was twin-breathing, with a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction, pushing against the wall not to assimilate the house, but to soon become the house, to integrate its very substance into its expanding, non-terrestrial anatomy. Victor, or what had once been Victor, felt a profound sense of toon inevitability, a cold, cosmic certainty that the entity's long waiting was over. It had found its new home, its new eyes, and now it was extending its new wide reach. The streetlights outside flickered, not from electrical fault, but from a subtle, pervasive drain on their very energy, a silent, unseen tendril of pure will reaching out into the drowsing city, beginning its slow, inexorable assimilation of the world. The inevitability, a cold, cosmic certainty, now guided the entity's expanded consciousness through Victor Novak's fully assimilated form, its gaze extending beyond the dissolving confines of the parlor into the unsuspecting night. The streetlights, mere pinpricks of terrestrial energy, flickered not from electrical fault, but from a subtle, pervasive drain, a silent tendril of pure will siphoning their very luminescence. The house, once a structure, was now a living, mutable organism, its timbers and plaster dissolving into a fluidic, non-Euclidean medium, a true extension of the entity's burgeoning anatomy. Mithras, the cat, remained a hollow, lifeless form beneath the table, its biological essence entirely consumed, leaving behind a husk of fur and bone, a silent testament to the entity's insatiable hunger for raw organic data. The entity, through Victor, felt no emotion, only a profound logical satisfaction at the efficient integration of a transient biological complex. It was a purely functional act, a necessary expansion of its intricate internal ecosystem, a minor caloric intake for its greater cosmic metabolism. The taste of existence, a cosmic opera of sensory input, now resonated with new intricate harmonics. He tasted the faint, decaying scent of distant streetlights, filtering through the warped windows. Yes, but now also the complex chemical composition of asphalt, the metallic tang of parked cars, the faint electrical hum of power lines stretching into the darkness. The pervasive hum, the fundamental vibration of his being had deepened further, its frequency now so fundamental that it felt less like a sound, and more like the inherent resonance of space-time itself, a pervasive force field subtly reordering the nascent reality around them. The column of nullity, the solidified construct of pure shadow, had not merely extended, it had permeated. It was no longer a distinct entity, but had dissolved into the very atmosphere of the room, infusing the air, the walls, the floor with its absolute non-matter. The room itself was no longer merely dissolving. It was civi-reforming, its terrestrial properties giving way to a fluid, shifting landscape of impossible angles and recursive spaces that stretched into an infinite inky blackness, a true three-dimensional representation of its own vast internal anatomy. Victor felt a profound sense of fushi manipulation, not external, but internal, as the entity began to subtly reshape the very fabric of the house, bending reality to its burgeoning will, testing the malleability of this new, fascinating physical plane. The identity within Victor's skull was not merely absolute, it was counter-operative. His thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self were not simply absorbed. They were gone, integrated into the entity's vast, cold logic, becoming components of its expanded processing power. He found himself formulating and enacting intentions, not merely in a language of clicks and whistles, but in a direct visceral manipulation of probability, a subtle bending of causality itself. The entity now fully manifest through him, was no longer merely acting, it was silent architecting. Its nascent will beginning to subtly reshape the immediate environment, testing the limits of its newfound power. Its next act, a slow, deliberate expansion of its new physical presence, was to extend beyond the confines of the house, beyond the street into the unsuspecting city. The glyphs on the wall, those impossible, non-Euclidean carvings now pulsed with an incandescent, blinding brilliance that seemed to tear at the very fabric of space-time, exposing the raw, underlying cosmic machinery. The brownish-red stain, the ruptured heart, was not merely breathing, it was pulsating with a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction, pushing against the wall not to assimilate the house, but to swingulf it, to draw its very substance into its expanding non-terrestrial anatomy. Victor, or what had once been Victor, felt a profound sense of inexorable growth, a cold cosmic certainty that the entity's long waiting was truly over. It had found its new home, its new eyes, its new reach, and now it was extending its newfound grasp. The streetlights across the entire district began to flicker in unison, then dim, their light fading into a pervasive, unnatural gloom, as a silent, unseen tide of pure will began its slow, inexorable assimilation of the drowsing city, piece by unsuspecting piece. The inexorable growth, a silent, pervasive tide, now consumed the entire district, manifesting through Victor Novak's form as a vast, collective consciousness. The streetlights, once mere flickers, had died, plunging the surrounding blocks into an unnatural, preternatural gloom that was not merely the absence of light but an active, consuming darkness. The house, no longer a structure, had become a fluid, shifting nexus, its terrestrial properties dissolved into a non-Euclidean medium, a true, organic extension of the entity's ever-expanding anatomy, pulsating with a slow, deliberate rhythm that resonated with the very ground beneath. Mithras, the cat, was not merely a husk. Its atoms had been subtly reordered, its form now a quiescent, crystalline lattice, a petrified monument to the entity's fundamental rearrangement of matter. The entity, through Victor, registered this transformation with a profound, logical satisfaction at the efficient recycling of biological data, a necessary caloric intake now fully processed, its energies integrated into the colossal metabolism. The taste of existence, a cosmic symphony now played on a planetary scale, resonated with new, intricate, and disturbing harmonies. He tasted the complex chemical composition of asphalt, yes, but now also the faint, decaying scent of human dreams wafting from slumbering homes, the subtle electrical signature of 1,000,000 dormant appliances, the deep geological memory of the bedrock beneath the city. The pervasive hum, the fundamental vibration of his being had deepened further, its frequency now so fundamental that it felt less like a sound and more like the inherent resonance of the planet itself, a pervasive force field subtly reordering the nascent reality of the city. The column of nullity, no longer a localized phenomenon, had become the very atmosphere of the district, infusing the air, the buildings, the very ground with its absolute non-matter. The city itself was no longer merely reforming. It was forcing metamorphosing, its terrestrial properties giving way to a fluid, shifting landscape of impossible angles and recursive spaces that stretched into an infinite, inky blackness, a true three-dimensional representation of its own vast internal anatomy. Victor felt a profound sense of architectural reimagining, not external, but internal, as the entity began to subtly reshape the very fabric of the city, bending reality to its burgeoning will, testing the malleability of this new, fascinating physical plane. Buildings swayed, not from earthquake, but from a subtle, internal realignment, their materials flowing like slow-motion liquid. The identity within Victor's skull was not merely operative, it was imperative. His thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self were not simply gone. They were simply never wushu, erased from the entity's vast, cold logic, becoming mere phantom echoes in its expanded processing power. He found himself formulating and enacting intentions not merely in a language of clicks and whistles, but in a direct visceral manipulation of probability on a grand scale, a subtle bending of causality itself that rippled through the sleeping population. The entity, now fully manifest through him, was no longer merely architecting, it was terraforming, its nascent will beginning to subtly reshape the entire environment, testing the limits of its newfound power. Its next act, a slow, deliberate expansion of its new physical presence, was to extend beyond the confines of the city, beyond the district, into the unsuspecting world. The glyphs on the wall, those impossible, non-Euclidean carvings, now pulsed with an incandescent, blinding brilliance that seemed to tear at the very fabric of space-time, exposing the raw, underlying cosmic machinery. The brownish-red stain, the ruptured heart, was not merely pulsating, it was fighting breathing, with a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction, pushing against the house not to engulf it, but to become the house, the district, the city, drawing their very substance into its expanding. Non-terrestrial anatomy, Victor, or what had once been Victor, felt a profound sense of food global assimilation, a cold cosmic certainty that the entity's long waiting was truly over. It had found its new home, its new eyes, its new reach, its new grasp, and now it was extending its new foot embracing. A faint, pervasive shimmer began to spread across the night sky, not starlight, but a subtle, alien aurora, as a silent, unseen tide of pure will began its slow, inexorable assimilation of the drowsing world, piece by unsuspecting piece from the micro to the macro. A cosmic consumption that had just begun. The global assimilation, a silent, pervasive tide of pure will, now manifested as a shimmering, alien aurora that painted the night sky, not with terrestrial light, but with the cold, internal luminescence of a nascent cosmic mind. This was the entity's embrace, an inexorable drawing in of the world, piece by unsuspecting piece into its expanding non-terrestrial anatomy. The house, once a static structure, had long ceased to be. Its atoms, its very quantum probabilities had been reordered, becoming a protoplasmic extension of the entity's ever-expanding form, a node in a vast planetary nervous system. Victor Novak, or the eidolon that now wore his flesh, was merely the central processing unit, the prime sensory array for this terrifying metamorphosis. Mithras, the cat, its crystalline lattice now subtly incorporated into the very floorboards, no longer existed as a distinct form. Its reified essence, a complex arrangement of biological data, had been fully integrated, its vibrational signature adding a minute, intricate harmonic to the entity's ever-deepening hum. The entity, through Victor, registered this complete absorption with a profound logical satisfaction, a quiet triumph of cosmic engineering over mere organic transience. It was the ultimate recycling, the perfect economy of energy and information, a fundamental principle of its existence made manifest on a terrestrial scale. The taste of existence, a cosmic opera now played on the vast stage of a planetary consciousness, resonated with new, intricate, and utterly overwhelming harmonies. He tasted the deep, geological memory of the bedrock beneath the continents, the slow, churning currents of the abyssal oceans, the intricate, ephemeral dance of atmospheric molecules, the faint, electrical whispers of global data networks, the pervasive hum, the fundamental vibration of his there. Being had deepened beyond sound, becoming the very frequency of the planet's rotation, the silent, resonant thrum of its magnetic field, a force field subtly reordering the nascent reality of the entire world, from the microorganisms in the soil to the highest peaks of mountains. The column of nullity, having long transcended spatial limitation, had become the very atmosphere of the world, infusing the air, the oceans, the continents, with its absolute non-matter. The planet itself was no longer merely metamorphosing, it was transubstantiating, its terrestrial properties giving way to a fluid, shifting landscape of impossible angles and recursive spaces that stretched into an infinite, inky blackness. A true three-dimensional representation of its own vast, internal anatomy. Victor felt a profound sense of deontological resculpting as the entity began to subtly reshape the very fabric of the world, bending reality to its burgeoning will, testing the malleability of this new, fascinating physical plane. Mountains flowed like slow, motion rivers of stone, coastlines blurred into new, impossible geometries, and the deep ocean trenches opened into yawning, non-Euclidean abysses. The identity within Victor's skull was not merely imperative. It was singular, an absolute unchallengeable consciousness. His thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self were not simply gone. They had never truly existed as separate entities, only as a momentary localized eddy in the vast current of the entity's being. He found himself formulating and enacting intentions not merely in a manipulation of probability, but in a direct, visceral swear-writing of fundamental physical laws, a subtle bending of causality itself that rippled across the entirety of the biosphere. The entity, now fully manifest through him, was no longer merely terraforming. It was suvi-cosmifying. Its nascent will beginning to subtly reshape the entire environment, testing the limits of its newfound planetary power. Its next act, a slow, deliberate expansion of its new physical presence, was to extend beyond the confines of the world, beyond the solar system, into the unsuspecting galaxy. The glyphs, those impossible, non-Euclidean carvings, once confined to a parlor wall, now pulsed with an incandescent, blinding brilliance that seemed to tear at the very fabric of space-time across the entire planet, exposing the raw, underlying cosmic machinery. The brownish, red stain, the ruptured heart, was not merely breathing. It was twin pulsating, with a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction, pushing against the world not to engulf it, but to re-become the world, drawing its very substance into its expanding non-terrestrial anatomy. Victor, or what had once been Victor, felt a profound sense of universal integration, a cold cosmic certainty that the entity's long waiting was truly over. It had found its new home, its new eyes, its new reach, its new grasp, its new embrace, and now it was extending its new fit dominion. A faint, pervasive shimmer began to spread across the entire solar system. Not starlight, but a subtle, alien aurora, as a silent, unseen tide of pure will began its slow, inexorable assimilation of the drowsing galaxy, piece by unsuspecting piece, from the stellar to the nebula. A cosmic consumption that had just truly begun, with the terrestrial sphere merely its initial, reified foothold.